Kudos to you. I've never done anything like this. I've never really tried to put my story together in this way, and you may not have attended something like this. So I think we're kind of in this together, but I'm grateful for us just taking that chance and seeing what God does. I'm going to open with prayer and kind of dive in. God, thanks for your faithfulness, for your goodness, for the way you call us from every tribe, tongue, and nation as your family, your household. And we pray your spirit would be leading us, our hearts and our minds, as we join together. Yes, in my story, but very much your story through my story. And my prayer is that it might weave all of our stories, speak to all of our stories. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. Where to start? Maybe first we start with a brief why. Why tell my story as it relates to race and racism in this country? And at one level, it's as simple as this. I think we learn a great deal about ourselves when we have to try and put our words into a story form. It is one of the more revelatory practices with which I think we can engage. And we learn a great deal about ourselves when we receive stories. In fact, I'm convinced Jesus so frequently taught by way of parables because he was a master teacher, a master rabbi. He recognizes hearts are opened, confronted, encouraged, changed through story. Right now, in our country, we are grappling with our call as a church in a time of profound unrest, particularly along the lines of racial injustice. And I think for most of us, myself included, we hardly know where to begin. Or if we have begun, we likely have quickly become overwhelmed or perhaps paralyzed or uncertain. And so perhaps we back up and we consider a story. And in my story, I hope perhaps the Holy Spirit will prompt you to consider parts of your story and our story together. And we'll see what the Lord has to do in all this. This is being recorded. I know some folks can't make it tonight, so I'm grateful that we're able to do that. I'll start with place and then move chronologically from there. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, a suburb called Wyoming. Mostly white students in this Wyoming public school I attended, but looking back through high school yearbook, I estimate maybe 10 or 15% were Black. I knew most of them in my grade, played on sports teams with a few of them. I bet if you called any of them today, they would remember me and they would probably say, Bobby was a good guy. And yet you will hear in my story, even though I had good relationships with Black students at my school, I do think I was probably blind to some things. I grew up in a community with the idea that racism was largely a thing of the past. I never consciously thought about that fact as much as I just sort of assumed it, kind of like the air you breathe. And I knew about sort of racism, racial strife, 60s, 70s. Brown versus Board of Education was the answer on my history test that I know some of you lived, about that landmark ruling that declared segregated schools unconstitutional. And it always struck me as a student as kind of odd and a bit obvious that should probably be the way things go. And my thought was, well, I guess, things were one way back then. I'm glad we sort of figured it out. One of the first things that comes to my mind when I think about my story as it relates to race and racism is who most of my favorite athletes and musicians were growing up. And get on this, on my wall growing up for years, I had a poster. Does anyone recognize these five? This is the Fab Five. They played at the University of Michigan at one point in the 90s. Absolutely my favorite basketball players. They were on my wall for years. Ken Griffey Jr. was my favorite baseball player, and I collected his cards by the dozens. Boys to Men, I thought had the smoothest, best voices in the entire world. And I absolutely loved their music. And then some of you may recall the TV show Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I thought that was just the funniest. All so good. And then we took a trip to Detroit growing up, and I had saved my allowance the whole summer just to spend it on albums in the Motown Museum. All of it good, but if I were paying attention, there were signs that even as I'm growing up in a good neighborhood, rule-following kid, something in the air was probably amiss. I might start with those posters, the baseball cards, the albums, the TV shows. It never crossed my mind. I so appreciated Black people as gifted athletes and entertainers. But honestly, never once did I have a Black teacher or coach during any part of my school years, including college and seminary. As a voracious reader in the middle school, I began reading a lot of books outside the school curriculum. So I was diving into 6th, 7th grade, Michael Crichton, John Grisham. Early high school, I was into Christian authors like C.S. Lewis, Oswald Chambers, R.C. Sproul. Some of these authors, obviously more entertaining. Others stretched me intellectually and theologically, and I'm grateful for these authors. I mean, I enjoyed it. But I confess, I cannot recall ever reading a Black author, thinker, certainly not theologian, except for a small handful of required readings in high school. In other words, when I looked out at my educated world, at the educated world, the professional world out there, Black people held almost no place in my imagination. Not that I didn't think they couldn't be there, not at all. I knew of some certainly politicians that were leaders, but I never really personally experienced that in my formative years and never gravitated towards choosing those authors. How does that affect one's worldview? If you grow up in a city that's 45% Black and are never taught by them or read their work, I'm not actually sure, but I know it's part of my story, and it's one I'll come back to a little bit later. I grew up, I said, in Wyoming, Ohio. You see the little kind of sideways sign there. That is the sign you would see and all the ways you enter to the suburb. I never considered the fact that there was one smaller corner of the suburb where the houses were smaller and the cars not as nice, and we really never drove through it. And almost everyone there was Black, and most everywhere else in Wyoming was white. And honestly, that dynamic was true throughout Cincinnati. And I never considered it strange. I really understood all people to be equal, treated everyone with equal dignity, respect. That's how I was raised. I think someone is accidentally sharing their screen, so I'm going to stop that for a second. I never honestly noticed anything odd, potentially wrong, unjust about the profound difference in the way the resources divided, quite literally in my community, by a train track when it came to the neighborhood. And I wonder if that's not like seeing a sign that's tilted. It's right. It's off. It's not right. But if you pass it so frequently, it's just kind of what is. What I remember is how people in Wyoming would sometimes point to the historical houses there. There are these gorgeous houses built in the early and mid 1800s, and they would comment. This was like common knowledge. The basements in those homes were a final stop along the Underground Railroad. Slaves would cross the Ohio River and be led along a route where their first taste of freedom was right in these houses. Truth is, I've researched that. I've found nothing to prove it. I've actually found plenty to suggest it's highly unlikely, since the railroad was not actually underground or linked through, basements. But I remember the way that comment solidified in my heart that we Ohioans, we Wyoming Ohioans, we are good people. I mean, I didn't go about bragging about being an exceptionally good person, but that story definitely grew in me this sense of pride about how those basements solidified that sense all the more that, racism and its evil and whatever else is kind of a thing of a past and really long past for Cincinnati people. Now, our family, we were members of College Hill Presbyterian Church. There it is. Remarkable place to grow up. So formative in so many positive ways. Somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 members when I was growing up. Almost no Black people. I think 2 from the Congo, I remember. One was married to a white one also, and then the third one was married to a white woman in the congregation. There might have been a couple more. This probably should have been pretty strange to me because the neighborhood of that church is easily 60 to 70% Black. In other words, almost all of the 1,500 to 2,000 members drove into an area of town that none of us lived in for Sunday church. And almost all of them came from, quite frankly, nicer parts of town because College Hill itself was fairly run down. But again, that was just something I downloaded as normal. Predominantly black neighborhoods, just in disrepair. It never crossed my mind as to how those things might have happened, or if Jesus had any thought on that. I had no clue, for instance, about how in the first half of the 20th century, so many communities across the nation had restrictive covenants on their houses, which prohibited leasing or selling those to particular groups, primarily black people. And I'll come back to that later as it relates to my personal story. Now, that practice was outlawed in 1948, but it certainly had a profound effect on the parts of the city that black people were allowed to build a life for the first half of the 20th century. That, along with some other practices, some of you may have heard of redlining, all the rest, those definitely shaped some of the dynamics about College Hill and so forth. That's not the focus of tonight's topic. Let me just say this, if you do want to learn more about that. Do you all know VeggieTales? Some of you maybe have heard of them, yes. Those cartoons that your children or grandchildren watch to learn about Bible stories. It's really great. Leo loves them. Well, their creator, Phil Vischer, has come out with an exceptionally well done 17-minute video, just like 4 days ago, where he talks about the last 100 years of this nation's history. And he details, because he's a filmmaker, with really helpful graphics and narration, sort of about our housing policies and some of the drug policies, the incarceration laws, and other things that have affected Black and white communities differently, and how in some ways we are the way we are with some of our configuration. Again, that's not the point of tonight's talk, but if that's sort of kind of an interest of you and you want to kind of think on that a little bit more, I'm just throwing the link in the chat box on the right, and watch it later, see what you think. But basically he gets at sort of what we mean when we talk about that big word, systemic racism. And what it means that even if every person tomorrow had not an ounce of racism in our individual bodies, still the systems in our society are shaped and informed by the scourge of racism. And that's one of the more complex and difficult issues we're facing today. I will say, going back to the church, I remember I was considered one of the more mature people in the youth group. I read my Bible, I was trusted with leadership, and I could tell you down cold, Ephesians 2:9, for it is by grace you have been saved by faith. This is not from yourself. This is a gift of God. Right? Grace, grace, grace. Isn't that the heartbeat of the Reformed tradition of Presbyterianism? I mean, so beautifully, wonderfully true. I am thankful I received that message time and again. We do not earn our favor with God. We as sinners receive an unmerited favor in Jesus Christ. And that has held me and that holds me. I confess, though, it wasn't until the last decade I actually discovered in any depth where Paul goes from there in Ephesians with the implication of this very radical grace. And where are we? Just 4 verses later. For Jesus himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of two, thus making peace, and in his body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away and peace to those who were near. For through him we both, Jew and Gentile, have access to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. We are saved by grace, and so by grace reconciled vertically with God and horizontally with one another. And so Paul names the deepest ethnic divide of his time, Jew and Gentile, and says, Jesus has made them one household of faith. That's how profound this grace is. It tears down even the things, the most difficult divides of a society. And so it's no wonder, right? Paul's always writing to these early Christians about their quarrels, about what to eat, what to wear, who to circumcise, right? These were all practical ways the church was genuinely, regularly trying to discover the gift of being one household in real time, with very real cultural issues, biases, and prejudices. Now, we may not deal with those quite same issues, but something about all of that comes, I think it comes to us as readily relevant today, right? And what a gift to know the fullness of this gospel truth. The wall has been broken down. We are one household. But honestly, that part of Ephesians and its implications for how we live as a church today, those were just far more muted in my upbringing. On the ethnic racial reconciliation side of things, I do, however, remember the mid-1990s, how a Christian band called DC Talk came out with this hugely popular album, popular for sort of the Christian youth at the time, called Jesus Freak. This was a band of three guys who'd met at Liberty University in Virginia, two white, one black. They had a song called Colored People. And the lyrics are there. Pardon me, your epidermis is showing, sir. I couldn't help but note your shade of melanin. I tip my hat to the colorful arrangement because I see the beauty in the tones of our skin. We've got to come together and thank the maker of us all. We're colored people and we live in a tainted place. We're colored people and they call us the human race. We've got a history so full of mistakes and we are colored people who depend on a holy grace. A piece of canvas is only the beginning. For it takes on character with every loving stroke. This thing of beauty is the passion of the artist's heart. By God's design, we are a skin kaleidoscope. We've got to come together. Aren't we all human after all? And then the bridge. Ignorance has wronged some races, and vengeance is the Lord. If we aspire to share this space, repentance is the cure. Go check it out on Spotify or something. It's a fun 90s song. Let me see if I've stopped sharing. That was the first time I heard anyone really talk about race. This album I bought. Race wasn't talked about in my family, and I think the quiet message was meant to be race shouldn't matter. We're all equal. And I believe that deeply. But I think the message I actually also got was race doesn't matter. Our history of racism in this country has no bearing on any of these realities today. We don't see race. It was striking to me that a band would make a whole song about race. It was powerful the way they named this truth, anchored in Genesis 1, right? That all of us are this beautiful diversity made in the image of God. Each of us fully worthy of love, respect, honor. But I didn't know, why would a band feel compelled to sing about this when it's such an obvious truth in our day and time? Why had they written this song? What would they were responding to? What had they experienced? I remember the OJ Simpson trial, about the same time as this album came out. I remember how obvious it was that he was guilty. And this was across the board with most of my fellow 8th grade students and all their parents who seemed glued to the TV and the trial, like mine were at the time. And I wrote it off as this sort of strange aberration when I heard over the news, or even among some of my black classmates, that there was rejoicing among many in the black community in light of this not guilty verdict. Now, I had no idea the history of the LAPD and the black community in Los Angeles, the profound mistrust therein, and therefore in the evidence that was presented before, what it was, I think 9 of the jurors were black. I had no inkling for the way this case was, yes, about OJ Simpson, but was also, almost more importantly for many black people, a case that carried so much symbolism. It was a victory led by a black man, Johnny Cochran, over a white justice establishment that had seen too many unjust trials involving black people. And so I just thought, black people were really blind to a pretty obvious truth. Truth is, I now understand most everybody, including the black community, agree he seems guilty, and they have for some time. I share this story because I could not see how a history of suspicion and distrust was informing the situation in very important ways for many in the black community. I thought in pretty ahistorical ways, but many in the black community saw this as a victory, a much longer narrative of injustice. At the time then, again, I wrote it off, they're rejoicing off as sort of ignorance at best, willful wrongheadedness at worst, and in the end, an odd blip on the radar around race and I just sort of forgot about it. I will say one of my more painful memories around race involves baseball. Every year during middle school, I played on the Wyoming select baseball team, and we were always a top team. But one team I did not like to play was the team over from Lincoln Heights. Lincoln Heights is a small suburb in Cincinnati. It's quite poor. It's fairly run down, some of the city's lowest performing schools, and around 90% Black. Main reason I did not like playing them was this: they scared me, and for a specific reason. I played first base, which meant when one of their players hit the ball to, say, our shortstop, the shortstop would field the ball and throw the ball to me. The Lincoln Heights player would be racing down towards first base. I'd have 1 foot on first base. That's what you do as a first baseman. And I'd be out with my glove, waiting to catch that ball. Well, a good number of times, the Lincoln Heights player would try and not only stomp down on first base, they would try to purposely take their cleats and dig down the back half of my calf so as to hurt me, and then land on first base and keep running. It was painful, and they were pretty good at doing it. I never spoke up about it because I was afraid, but also just ever so slightly in my middle school mind, I intuited that in some way I might have had something better with my situation, at least based on what I could see with their neighborhoods I didn't understand and the kind of baseball gear they were showing up with. And so I didn't feel I needed to add to whatever they had going on. What I could not have nearly seen or appreciated was that I was busy thinking the scourge of racism, that's sort of long past. But they're living in a small suburb of Cincinnati that was incorporated in 1947 as the first primarily Black self-governing community in the north of the Mason-Dixon line. They had tried to incorporate in 1939, but time and again, though, the surrounding white communities kept the vote from happening and used the extra time to slowly annex surrounding areas, particularly the areas where there were some businesses and therefore a tax base. When Lincoln Heights finally incorporated in 1947, 8 years after they had wanted to, they were then 1/10 the size of their original plan because of all the annexations, which left them very little business for a tax base to start to secure a solid infrastructure. Given that some of the communities in Cincinnati had those laws disallowing Black people from buying houses in white areas, it was a limiting reality into which Lincoln Heights was incorporated. And it was a limiting reality that only eventually grew worse and worse as the long lack of strong tax base kind of accentuated the issues around trying to keep it safe, the infrastructure, the schools. By the 1990s, I was playing baseball against them. Again, it was just an extremely poor neighborhood and surrounded by this largely affluent, growing white suburbs. And one has to think aliens from outer space might look down upon that and think, now, why don't all those folks in this few square miles just sort of mix up their resources, work together? It's all very odd, that island of poverty that does fall curiously along racial lines. What do we make of that? But again, when you drive by a broken sign long enough, it just looks normal. That was how I saw Cincinnati. Systematic racism formed Lincoln Heights. And again, that's not the point of this narrative. You can watch the VeggieTales guys for just the way he narrates some of that. And I don't think any of us could nearly have talked about any of that, but I don't doubt that the Lincoln Heights players intuited something wrong about the way reality had worked for them and their families. And again, this is my interpretation, but my sense is I think those cleats on my calf were a way of them pushing back, not even so much on me as an individual, but in some ways on what I represented as a white person. I sense it was a cry, a declaration, a visceral way to make it clear they were there, they were human, they were strong. I couldn't have said that or seen that then. I just knew that Black baseball players of my age could be really mean, and they scared me. Somewhere toward the end of middle school and early high school, I realized that even as baseball was my favorite sport, I'd never make it to the majors. But at that very same time, a distinct dream came to my heart. I thought one day as I grow older and I graduate college, I'm gonna coach baseball in my spare time. In particular, I had a vision of going to a rougher, rundown neighborhood of some sort and teaching kids baseball. I saw this as bringing my gifts and my passion for baseball to serve others. And truth be told, always I envisioned coaching Black children, who of course, to my mind, were always the poor ones who needed someone to show up and coach. I replayed this dream in my mind a number of times in high school. It was honestly kind of energizing to think of this courageous way of loving others as a Christian. Never once did it cross my mind to maybe move into a neighborhood that I was seeking to serve, or befriend the community I was envisioning, or even think of ways it might go much further if and be more empowering and effective for a Black person, a man or a woman, to do the coaching or teaching. My vision was really always for how I was going to teach or coach. In fact, that vision, that dream, it probably brought together two of my main assumptions that I lament, but are just honest about what normal looked like growing up. I would never have said it this way. The Black people I saw or knew were either athletes or entertainers, and or poor, or at least poorer than the white people I knew. I remember how my best friend from 6th grade all the way through high school, and even really to this day, I consider him my best friend. He's in Boston. He's Asian American, second generation. His parents are immigrants from China. And I remember how he once told me, almost in a manner of shameful confession, I'm a Twinkie, which is to say he's yellow on the outside, but white on the inside. He looks Asian, but culturally he speaks, acts, assumes the world to be a certain way, like a white person. And I remember that sounding so strange. What does it mean to think and see and act like a white person? It was one of the first times where I was trying to consider that maybe many of the things I thought of as normal about how the world works and how people interact and the way we assume things go, maybe those were a distinct culture I had just assumed. I recently read the following from a white pastor in Chicago who pastors a multicultural congregation and actively works towards racial justice, reconciliation as central to he and his congregation's calling. It's in his book, Rediscipling the White Church. And he says, as the cultural majority in this country, the problem for white people is that we don't think of ourselves as a distinctive culture, but as a neutral standard by which other cultures are categorized. That Twinkie comment woke me up ever so slightly to this idea that I did see myself as kind of the neutral standard. What did it mean to be distinct? I remember how during high school I grew in my awareness about other schools, public and private. I recognized that my public school was a nationally ranked public school, and I enjoyed wearing my letter jacket around town, and I would never have said this aloud, but I felt it inside. We are a public school. We are not one of those uppity private schools. And yet we are every bit as smart and high ranking as them. I wore public school, quite frankly, as a form of pride. What I was 100% blind to was the fact that Wyoming, Ohio has higher housing costs than most communities in Cincinnati. It requires higher property taxes to live there, which of course fund the schools. These two realities quickly sift out lower income people, which was often the Black community in Cincinnati, and in large part because of some of the things discussed in the VeggieTale clip you can watch later. Point being, I was blind to the fact that in one sense, I did go to a private school where you very much did have to pay for quality education. And I dearly love my high school, my teachers, classmates. I mean, I really do. But I do see that where I carried great pride, I was deeply blind to advantages that I was hiding under the guise of, well, I go to public school. I can remember when my mom had an medical emergency one Christmas in high school. While I was in high school, some police and medics arrived to our house to help. Among them was a guy named Mike World. He had graduated a couple years before me, and he had played high school with me on the baseball team. And I thought it was so cool that Mike World, now a police officer in training, was in my home helping my mom. It was one of a few encounters I've had with police over the years, whether helping with directions, giving me mercy over speeding tickets, which has happened on 3 or 4 occasions, or just chewing the fat on the sideline of an event. From the earliest age, even to now, I have not only known positive encounters with the police, but honestly, exceptionally positive encounters. Kind, helpful, wanting to do the right thing. I share this because one of the things I never saw was just how safe I assumed the world to be. I trusted authority. things went wrong, yes, call the police. They protect you. They'll save you. I mean, I had no idea anyone anywhere else, certainly not in our country, would grow up without a basic assumption that they're safe and that if they're not, authority will protect you. I feel immensely grateful to have lived that narrative. But I will say this because one of the hardest parts of this journey for me is trying to hear voices who've known other experiences. It's jarring for me, but that for some, the police are the last people they would call, or for some, they're even understood to be the enemy. I remember in December 2000, how I drove with one of my college friends to North Carolina, from North Carolina to his parents' home in New Orleans, where we planned to hang for 3 days before I flew to Cincinnati for Christmas. One day we went to the Gulf to fish with his dad and his dad's friend, and we're getting on the boat. We meet his dad's friend, and his dad's friend immediately begins talking about Black people using the N-word. He said it kind of nonchalantly with a bit of a smile that said, you know how it is when it's just the white people around. We can talk like this. Now, I was pretty shy, freshman in college, uncomfortable with these words. I really didn't hear them, and I didn't know what to say or how to say why that felt wrong and carried such a deep, painful history. I just felt awkward, and all the more so watching my friend and his dad laugh with the guy in a way that kind of communicated, oh, you know, Joe, harmless, just says whatever. Now, I had no idea this way of being was around outside of sort of movie depictions, but it captured something I would continue to find exist in some pockets of white communities. I certainly saw it in certain pockets, even in Richmond in recent years. And it's this idea that white people are generally good folks. Sometimes we speak our mind. We have thoughts about Black people. It doesn't mean a thing. It's not all Black people. People need to get over it. It's harmless. And I remember how fearful and timid and weak I felt standing silently. And so wondering what this undercurrent was that this callous, casual language carried. I didn't know about that. I remember how the summer of 2001, I spent 10 weeks in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina as part of a college ministry endeavor that focused on bringing college students from various schools in North Carolina to do in-depth discipleship and evangelism. And part of the experience was holding down a 40-hour-a-week minimum wage job. And I remember how one of my very best friends that summer was Tim Bird, a Black student from UNC Charlotte. I remember how much I cherished our conversations and our time and our prayer together. He was the first Black person with whom I had a deep connection, and one that sadly kind of drifted once we went back to our different colleges, and this is pre-social media. I also remember how I fundraised for this endeavor, like all of us on the trip, to go on this particular ministry experience. And I was able to fundraise the full amount, just reaching out to all my aunts and uncles and family and the rest. Tim, however, raised very little from his network. And so he had to use most of his weekly paycheck from his minimum wage job at Kroger to pay for him to be present on this same trip with all of us. And me, I just kept saving my minimum wage check in the bank. Tim had one dress shirt with him for the whole trip. He wore it every Sunday. It was a shirt made by the hip hop brand FUBU. I'd always compliment Tim on his shirt. And I said, Tim, you just look smooth in that silk shirt. And one day he said, you know what, you like it? It's yours. He literally gave the nicest shirt off of his back, even as he's weekly writing his Kroger check over to the campus ministry just to be on this 10-week trip. I had to go into the room and cry, weep, because I've been humbled by the generosity of the gospel of Jesus Christ I did not deserve. To be sure, this baggy FUBU silk shirt did not wear well on this skinny white boy, but that was hardly the point. I went and I wrote him a check a couple days later to cover a chunk of what he still owed to be on this trip, not because I'm an amazing person or a generous person. Honestly, I was so overwhelmed by the nature of the grace of Jesus through Tim Bird that it prompted in me an unrestrained gratitude that had to come out. Isn't that so Reformed theology? Grace prompts gratitude. I also remember in 2001 being in college when Cincinnati had the largest race riots in LA in 1992, and it occurred after a police officer killed an unarmed black man, and I don't know any of the other details, but the thing that struck me in college was how odd that sounded. People would ask me, "Yo, you're from Cincinnati," and I'd say, "Well," and they'd say, "What do you think about it?" I said, "It's just strange. I mean, it's a chill city. It's great people. It's the Midwest, right? It's just a bunch of really nice, atypically cheesy people." A race riot struck me as so odd. I had no category to put it in my mind. The point being, I was so far from any ability to stand in the shoes of black people, particularly the 45% who called Cincinnati home, that I just wrote the thing off. And like so many other occasions in my story, it was an odd blip on the radar, and I forgot about it. Michelle and I were married right out of college. We had this huge wedding, invited all of our college friends, high school, her parents, my folks, just invited our network. And I think the wedding list had 250 invitees on it. And maybe 220 or so showed up. It was huge in Houston. Not a single black person on the list. Not because we didn't like black people or have some connections, but simply because our social circle, even our family social circles at their widest, had no meaningful connection to a black person. I say all this not to point out how all my formative years built to a point where I lived in this diverse country, diverse city, and somehow managed to enter adulthood with the 250 closest people to be all being white. And I didn't notice it, actually. And I don't say this because these are all bad people. I mean, naturally, we gravitate towards people who look like us or think like us. I mean, that happens for everybody. But it does seem evidence to me that there's something in the psyche and structures of our society that keeps us apart to an abnormal and even unhealthy level, particularly when it comes to the church, whose gospel proclaims we share in one household of faith. In 2010, I got a call from Mark Labberton, now the president of Fuller Seminary. He was a professor there at the time. I was an associate pastor at Atlanta, having attended Fuller Seminary. Mark was starting a new program called Micah Groups, where he would form pastoral cohorts around the nation who would spend 2 years studying the intersection of justice and worship. He asked if I'd help found an Atlanta cohort of 10 or 14 pastors from different denominations, ages, men and women, various races. "Bobby, I want you to co-facilitate a group," and I was intrigued, but can you help find a co-facilitator who's not white, preferably female? Well, eventually, through a friend of a friend, I did. I found Reverend Jasmine Smothers, who's today the senior pastor of First United Methodist Atlanta, Georgia. But boy, it was humbling to recognize the first time I tried to connect with pastors outside the Presbyterian bubble that I only really knew a few others, and they were all white. Point being, in general, I find pastors are rarely better at living into the unity we share in the body of Jesus Christ. We struggle with this work. We sometimes leave it alone because it's hard or we don't know what to do. I'm grateful that was a wonderful group, the Micah group. I could share more about my time in seminary or the Army Reserves or Atlanta, but really the narrative didn't change in terms of, I thought racism's bad, it's mainly in the past, and I really don't think about it much. I think you could summarize my story up to that point as sort of classic white privilege. I know that's a loaded word and unfortunately politicized couple words. It's not to suggest that white people have no burdens or struggle, not at all. I mean, many of us have known more than we would ever wish upon another. I know that. But in terms of our society, my story is one where I've benefited greatly from coming from a white family in terms of where I lived and my family was able to live, the schools, the healthcare, the assumption that college was going to happen, the fact that my family could slowly build equity in homes over generations, the assumption of safety, the ability to tune out the worries and problems and riots and issues of the city because it just didn't affect me. All these were advantages I was born into and didn't earn and rarely noticed. Paul in Romans writes about not being conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And the truth is the patterns can be so deeply embedded and invisible. And at least for me, it took painful rumblings for me to even begin to see the patterns that felt normal for so long. And those painful rumblings began in 2014. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin. Not until their deaths and the unrest and the protests that followed did I sense at some level what Martin Luther King Jr. spoke up in 1968. There are literally two Americas. And you can guess what he means. I won't read the full quote. 2014 was the first time this decades old idea was truly unsettling me, was sounding eerily relevant. It was so unsettling. I went to the archives room of the church I was serving in Richmond, Virginia, right along Monument Avenue, where you see those massive monuments right now, and some of them have been toppled. Um, and I looked in the archives room to see if any other pastors had preached on race or racism in the recent decades, because this church kept this archive of all these sermons. Found a sermon in 1969 entirely devoted to addressing racism and calling for justice and amid societal unrest. I found a sermon from 1994 overtly lamenting the Confederate monuments right outside the church's front doors and the racism in the city. Both sermons read so relevantly to the matters at hand that my sermon one Sunday in December 2014 began by quoting directly from both of those sermons and then asking the question, is it possible I could just keep reading these two sermons and one might not even know there was a time difference? And then at one point in the sermon, I quote Ed Stetzer, a pastor who was writing an article for Christianity Today in 2014 amid the unrest in Ferguson. He said, for many, Ferguson's about an incident. Yet for many African Americans, it's about a system. Sounds a lot like the OJ thing, right? It's worth listening to why people are responding differently to the situation in Ferguson. I didn't know what Ed Stetzer meant by system. Again, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, like the OJ, individual things that were just heartbreaking. We need to figure out. But the unrest and protests were at such a level, I sensed I did need to learn. The sermon was terrifying for me to preach. I'll never forget the reaction. A number of white congregants kindly thanked me. One white woman let me know in no uncertain terms it is a downer to come to the church and hear about racism. And she and some others who she was talking to didn't want to hear that. I remember one white man in his mid-90s, coming up and saying with vigor, I want to grow. I want to learn. And that humbled me to no end. But mostly I remember the remarks to the Black members. This congregation had 12 Black members, 10 baby boomers, 2 Gen Xers. Normally, one or two of them might say a nice sermon after worship. And on this particular Sunday, 11 of the 12 actively sought me out, looked me in the eye, and they said, thank you. And do you know those moments when someone looks you in the eye and you can tell their words are coming from a deep place? I was stunned by the gravity of their gratitude, like they'd been holding their breath or something for I don't know how long. And the energy with which their follow-up phone calls and emails poured forth after that sermon. And for the first time, I was given a glimpse into the heart of at least some Black people for whom this nation and the church can be understood so differently, given our history. It set me on a journey. I felt a need to heed the call of my own sermon, which is to listen to Black voices, listen and learn. I'm embarrassed to admit, until 2014, I didn't have a single Black theologian on my huge bookshelf other than Martin Luther King Jr. So I started ordering Black theologians. How had I never heard their voices? And what made me think the default authors who are definitely most orthodox and trustworthy are white males? I started watching movies and TV shows written by, featuring Black people. I started ordering other books by Black authors, also adding in Latina authors. Honestly, it felt like learning, and it feels like learning a foreign language. It causes the gears in my brain to really work. I think I was only just then just recognizing the hard truth of what Willie Jennings, Professor at Duke, writes. To the extent that we have been insiders, we must learn to identify with outsiders, which is a very Jesus way to think. To the extent Jesus was an insider equal to God, to that extent, he identified with us all the way into sin and death, right? Philippians 2. And again, my upbringing, definite insider. And so it is a foreign language trying to listen, learn in the language of the outsider in love. And yet surely that is where the good news of Jesus always unfolds, right? As part of this journey, I took an implicit bias test online, the Harvard Implicit Association test. A bunch of schools came together to make this. You can find it online today with a host of other tests like it. It helps us C, some of our unconscious biases. Bottom line, the test revealed something painfully true about myself. I showed a strong bias of favoritism toward white faces over and against black faces. Now, to be sure, all of us have some measure of implicit bias. If for no other reason, we're all unfamiliar with certain people groups. But it was striking the way that test revealed the way I more readily associated negative words with black faces and positive words with white faces. It was a very hard truth to confront, and yet I had to admit that I was more likely to see a black person as a threat than a white person, all things being equal. I was more likely to see a name that sounded black and assume a less intellect. And so I get at some level how when officers make life and death instant decisions in the heated, fearful moment, goodness, I could see how implicit bias can play a factor, particularly if, like me, one grows up acculturated so thoroughly by one group of people. In my December 2014 sermon, I commended both listening to black sisters and brothers and also building relationships with them. I told the congregation to try this with someone of another ethnicity or race in the coming days. I said, maybe just say this. I know we've never really talked. We don't know one another. But we're living in these times and we're family in Christ. I'd like to chat, to listen. And so I started doing that myself. I learned so much. I heard such a wonderful diversity of views that obviously cannot be captured into easy sound bites like we might hear on the news. I especially loved eventually finding connection and friendship with a local black stand-up comedian who's also super involved in the nonprofits of Richmond. And it was such a joy to sit and share coffees with him over the course of about a year and just learn from one another, share life, talk about scripture, glimpse the gospel in a relationship that would never have happened except by the Spirit's prompting. To be sure, these were sometimes awkward, humbling conversations, but also deeply, uniquely energizing as I was leaning into the Spirit's leading and listening for what it really means to come alongside these sisters and brothers for whom I had really not heard or noticed for so long. I remember two pastors from Ghana who worshiped with my congregation. I served in Richmond for a year as they were doing some continuing education at a nearby school. 2 months into their time in Richmond, first time they'd ever been to the States at all, I asked them, what do you notice about the U.S.? They said two things. The squirrels. Bobby, there are so many squirrels running around your nation. If this was Ghana, they'd all be captured, killed, and eaten. There's no way we'd let the squirrels run rampant like this. Of all the things I expected them to note about our country, not expected, nor was the second one. The other thing, Bobby, why your people treat us so well, us being black men from Africa who speak a British English. But why do you treat your black people so poorly? In 2 months' time, they had caught something in the way our society functions, I'll say at least Richmond, something in the way our patterns are lived among one another, that they could tell they were treated well by white people in a way that was different from the local black community. Wow. I remember scouring the library of the Union Theological Seminary and part of this learning process, eventually discovering that quite controversial that there was a strand of Presbyterianism that supported slavery by developing the doctrine of the spiritual church. It was a formal doctrine developed and taught, echoes of which were still part of my upbringing in the church. James Henry Thornwell. The church has no right to interfere directly with the civil relations of society, whether slavery be perpetuated or not, whether arrangements shall be made to change or abolish it, whether it conduces to the prosperity of the state or hinders progress of a refined civilization. These questions are not for the church, but for the state, not for ministers, but statesmen. Christian men may discuss them as citizens and patriots, but not as members of the Church of Jesus Christ. And of course, this was a significant way to theologically undergird not touching racism, slavery. Is there no refuge from strife? Is there no place of refreshing where man can prepare for the battle of life? Is there no place where two or three can gather in Jesus' name? to forget for the moment all the things that divide nation from nation, race from race, to forget human pride, to forget passions of war, to forget the puzzling problems of industrial strife, and to unite in overflowing gratitude at the foot of the cross. If there be such a place, then that is the house of God and the gate of heaven. And from under the threshold of that house will go forth a river that will revive the weary world. A theological underpinning that has a way of certainly celebrating the goodness of God, but we don't touch the way Jesus is Lord of all of society and what that might mean for living, not just sort of heavenly minded ways. So again, pretty kind of eye-opening. I'll kind of fast forward. I probably need about 10 more minutes, maybe 12 to finish. In 2016, we adopted Leo. That's day one, or day two, actually. I guess he was born the day before this photo. Wonderful story. I can share it another time, but I will say this. It was eye-opening, the training of our adoption. The adoption agency had us do with regard to raising a black boy. Side note, Leo's a Pacific Islander. Both his parents are from Papua New Guinea, but in the US, the term black ends up being the lens through which most darker skin tones are seen. It was eye-opening, the way they told us we would need to help him prepare for being seen differently, treated differently, suspected differently, even if doing the same thing as his white peers. The way we would need to lean into relationships with black families and those who've adopted black children so that he has a healthy model of people to look up to. And I'll tell you, once a black person is kind of really part of your immediate household, you shift. You begin to think, okay, our social relationships need to grow. Our dinner table conversations need to eventually have black people. The concerns of our hearts and budget will probably morph as we go closer to other people and see and experience reality differently. It was especially humbling as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, one who had proclaimed time and again that we are all sisters and brothers in Jesus Christ, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American. And yet as often as I proclaimed this gospel, it was not until Leo that it dawned on me, my gosh, once you're family, once you're a household of faith, it changes the fabric of your social relationship, just like we see in the New Testament, which is what makes it so hard and so beautiful. Why do I so easily dismiss this most central truth of the gospel? I have confessed and continue to confess my own strands of racism, my bias, my own neglect of embracing this most fundamental gift of the gospel. And yet I give thanks, God, in far too much infinite patience, has continued to prove faithful. In December of 2016, a group in Richmond led a multi-event endeavor called Unmasking RBA, in which Richmonders were invited to take off the mask we hide behind and work on honest conversation around race. So Michelle and I, we attended a writing workshop that was one of the offerings, and we're given these short prompts to reflect broadly on our experience of race and racism in Richmond. Specifically, we were given 10 minutes at a time to write whatever came to mind. Don't just keep the pen on the paper and then read it aloud to a small group gathered in the room who was also writing. We wrote and read 3 pieces, each of us, by the end of the evening, white and black. And I'm going to read you mine that I wrote that night, entitled Real Beauty. The prompt was, when you think about race, what comes to mind? I mean, there you go. That's as broad as it gets. Let me add, where the place I'm about to describe in this little writing I did in this 10-minute piece, it takes place in a community in Richmond, Virginia that to this day still has deeds attached to the houses that say no black or Jewish people may own this home. Now, realtors always give this over to the new homeowners and quickly say, look, this will not stand up legally in court. Don't worry. But legally, I do need to give you this and just make you aware it does read that way. Last night, we went to the annual lights display at the Ginter Park Botanical Gardens. The array of lights are remarkable against the backdrop of the night sky. It's just December, Christmas time. I did not notice until this evening that I saw no black or brown people there aside from our infant son. Does that mean something? I imagine there were people of other color there, but it is not at all part of my memory. I just see white people in puffy jackets with hot chocolate. Do people of other color go to other gardens? What aspects of that garden quietly, subconsciously tell me that I belong, that I am the kind of person who should get a membership? Are there certain aspects that make it clear to other races that it might not be the same kind of place for them? Nothing about the garden or the whole experience that night feels evil or wrong. And yet, why is it unsettling that the garden itself is so multicolored and the people so unicolored? Why does it feel disingenuous that the theme of this year's light display at the Botanical Gardens is in living color, but the present human palette so plain? How does this happen? Is it what it is, or is it emblematic of more? Does it say something about the gardens, the surrounding neighborhood, the location, the people, the history? Truly, I do not know. What I know is that I'm scared by how attractive the garden membership is. There is an eerie allure to living in a fantastical reality where I feel entirely comfortable. It is only my black son in front of me whose beauty reminds me that the light tour is an endless loop under a heavy sky. There is no progress safely membered there. The jackets insulate, the chocolate lulls, and the lights enchant. But eventually the electricity will fail or the plug will be pulled, and then it's just us and the wild again. Hopefully we will have spent some time pursuing real living color. We will need each other. We do. The naked, multicolored garden foliage itself whispers the truth to its stewards about what makes for real beauty. There's a passage in Mark chapter 8. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought Jesus a blind man. He touches him on the eye, spits on the eye, puts his hand on him and says, "Do you see anything?" He looks up, and I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more, Jesus puts his hand on the man's eyes, and then the eyes are open. Sight is restored, and he sees clearly. And right now, I feel Jesus has spit on my eye. He's put his hands on me and asked, "Do you see anything?" And at the moment, I see trees walking. I see. Sort of. I see through a glass dimly. I feel honestly I'm barely just starting to learn about the way racism is a power and principality in our country that holds invisible but very real sway over so many things. And the work it has done in previous generations still echoes through our society today. Yes, through individuals' implicit bias, but also in the way it affects our structures, like housing, healthcare, our institutes, like the church. And only I'm just starting to see my part in this. My blindness, my callousness, my apathy, my bias, my sin. I'm only just starting to see a glimpse of how profoundly radical the good news of Jesus Christ is, and that we share in this vision we find in Revelation of a day when truly every tribe, tongue, and nation will be gathered in all of their distinctiveness around the banqueting table of Jesus as family. And what a gift it is to pursue a glimpse of that reality on earth as it is in heaven right now. I'm just beginning to see how profoundly good and radical that news is, especially in our time. And I believe for the Holy Spirit to continue the work of unblinding my sight and inviting me further into God's kingdom work. My call is to be a listener, a student, and a disciple. My story began with the fact that I never once had a black teacher or coach. That if anything, I envisioned going into a black community and coaching them, teaching them. That was the vision. And the new vision has me not above and not in front, but below and behind, drawing closer and closer to those who've been on the outside and listening, hearing the voices that I heard almost none of during my formative years. I have no easy answers for the complex, confusing, and painful realities of our time, but I do think the Lord is faithful when we risk new listening and new relationships. And I do believe that on this road, we will glimpse the lived beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you all for your time. That's the story for now. It's 8 o'clock. So this is winding up the time, and I'm not going to belabor you longer than I promised. Some have asked about possibilities of follow-up conversation, questions, discussion, things you've been reading, your stories, all of it. So we may come up with more than this, but minimally, I'm committed to an hour at noon on Thursdays over Zoom with anyone that wants to show up to talk further, to ask more questions. Probably do this through July and maybe even into August. We'll see how long we go, but 7 or 8 weeks starting next Thursday at noon. You'll see a Zoom invite if you want to keep chatting or ask questions, or just come along and be totally quiet on Zoom and listen in. Totally fine too. And each week I'll provide, I'll come up with some small thing that we'll all be able to share in. Next week I have a TED Talk I think I'd love to have us all watch briefly and chat on. I invite you. Just Mercy is playing is a movie that's playing for free right now, streaming for free. You can Google Just Mercy. And if you watch that, we may have some time to chat on what you think about that. That's a great movie just to dive into while it's free during the month of June. You may have follow-up questions again on this talk. Also, last thing, some folks have been interested in reading a book. And I know that's hard to kind of stick with a book for the long haul. People just lose sight and whatever. So I'd rather go week by week, every Thursday, show up. It'll be something where you don't have to prepare much, or maybe read a quick article if you can, but if not, no worries. But I think maybe our first meeting in the month of August, so the first Thursday in August, might do a book discussion for folks who want to dive into a book together. And so I've got 2 books that are, I'm going to copy paste for you. You could link to, and just tell me if you prefer one or the other. They're kind of different approaches to having this conversation. One's more memoir-esque and probably a little harder hitting. One's kind of just helping people get into the conversation at all. And it's by a professor at Austin Seminary. One's called Anxious to Talk About It, talking about race. One's called I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. And if you show up to the meeting on Thursday and say, hey, I think maybe this book or that book, we'll see, we'll take a vote, we'll pick one, we'll go with it. Maybe we'll just read both. I don't know, but couple to juggle to think on. But again, a formal follow-up Thursdays at noon for any and all who'd like to come. No pressure to speak. You can always just listen in, and I'll always provide a prompt, so it's not like you guys have to come, ready to say something when it's hard or difficult or you're not sure. I look forward to doing that with you all, and thank you again. Feel free to email or call in the meantime as well. You don't have to wait a week either. Let's close in prayer. God, thanks. Thanks for your faithfulness and your goodness, for the diverse and beautiful family that you knit together in Jesus Christ. Give us courage, give us boldness, give us humility to know the gift of this gospel. In Jesus' name, amen. All righty.
Thanks. Bye.
Love you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bobby. No talk.
Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you.
Bye.
Hey, Annabelle.
Hey, I just had my surgery last Thursday.
I heard it went well. Excellent.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Absolutely. Glad you could make it.
It's awesome.
Shut in.
Mm-hmm.